the European construct or the Islamic construct today. All right, so let me go ahead and do a screen share on this. And there we go. So you'll have this also for your reference in the future, but let's get to the PowerPoint. Okay, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about both Europe and the Middle East during the period that we're going to be examining a few different works. We're starting with the 1001 Nights, the Travel and Conquests, Medieval Lyrics, but this also goes beyond Test 2 into Beowulf, Sir Gawain, and the Green Knight, and other works that we're going to be focusing on. But people in the Middle Ages would have considered ethnic groups then as a part of a continent, even within modern day countries. Somebody would have identified probably much more strongly as being Norman, which is a province now in France, in the north of France, than they would have been as French, even though they may have a language in common with other people. In the Arab world, it was similar. There were parts of the Arab world that were separated or ruled primarily by kingdoms or caliphates in Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo for North Africa, and even into Europe in Portugal and Spain. So to think of medieval Europe as a whole, or even the Muslim world as a whole, isn't the way that those people would have viewed themselves. Okay, so we'll start with kind of the beginning of the Middle Ages, which is the Jewish people didn't play nicely with the Romans. There were rebellions before the age of Jesus of Nazareth, and the final rebellion was in 70 CE, at which point the Romans said, okay, the problem with the Jews in Judea is there's Jews there, so we need to get rid of them. And they sent them throughout Europe, which, of course, they never had one nation again until 1947. For 2,000 years, almost, there was no homeland for those of the Jewish faith. Now, the idea of Christianity also didn't develop all at once. The slide reads, Jewish followers of James and John who had embraced the gospel in those mixed of Jewish and Gentile communities, Gentiles, somebody who is not of the Jewish faith, adopted Paul's Hellenized brand of Christianity. They were exiled after the Roman suppression of 70 CE. However, codified Christian doctrine did not appear until Jerome's production of the Latin Bible and Augustine's works almost 3 centuries later. In fact, Emperor Constantine of the Western Roman Empire was the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. Until then, Christians were used as fodder for the Colosseum. So what developed into the Catholic Church, which is the basis for Christianity today, didn't really develop until much later, 3 or 4 centuries after the crucifixion of Jesus. The values of Rome and its celebration of the arts and worldly pleasures were very much at odds with Christian ethic that demanded rejection of worldly things. Classical principles of poetic composition became applied to new types of writing, including religious hymns and saints' lives and confessions, which is, of course, what we're interested in this class, because we're looking at this stuff as stories and works of literature as opposed to works of religion. But because the Middle Ages is somewhat considered the age of religion, it's difficult to separate the two. And also, as Christianity is developing, in order to avoid civil war within Rome, merging Christianity with the religions of the time. That's why the Sabbath for Christians is Sunday. Early Christians celebrated on Saturday, as those of the Jewish faith do, but in order to appease people who worship the sun god, that's why it's named Sunday, they moved the Sabbath to Sunday as opposed to Saturday. There's a lot of those types of things where the Christian religion was interwoven with existing pagan religions. Do bunnies and eggs have to do with Jesus? Well, they're pagan fertility rituals, springtime rituals that have been integrated into Christianity in order to get converts. So this started a long, long time ago with the Christian church. Okay, so another important thing that we need to know about this age and Europe is the city of Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul. While the capital of Rome remained the seat of the imperial power in the west, the city of Byzantium, Istanbul, represented Rome in the east. So I misspoke earlier. Constantinople is the capital of the Eastern Empire. Germanic tribes invaded Italy during the 5th century, while Rome's eastern capital remained intact until the end of the Middle Ages. Boethius, a historian, bears witness to the decay of Rome and the birth of the new Christian. And really to this day, the Russians have a bugaboo about Constantinople, that it really was the Mecca for early Christianity, because it was the city named after Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor. That's where Christianity could flourish, even in Rome's decay, because these Germanic tribes that invaded Italy, tore apart the countryside, and they were pagans, and remained so really until 800 or 900 CE. The early Christians had a very difficult time converting the Nordic type of cultures. Okay, so that's early Christianity. To Islam, because it's an important part of the Middle Ages. Muslims controlled much of what's called the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain, until 1492. That was a very important year, not just because Columbus left for what they called the New World, but also because that's when the Moors were taken out of Spain, or kicked out of Spain. Okay, so what is Islam in Arabic means obedience. And this was a religion started by the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad was a resident of Mecca, and the story is that he would go on these spiritual journeys outside of Mecca, and in the caves, in the hills nearby, he actually would encounter the Archangel Gabriel, who recited the Quran to Muhammad. Now, the Quran was not written down until about a century after Muhammad's death. However, there were people in the early Muslim community whose job it was to memorize the Quran. And I think especially in the modern era, we take for granted the human being's ability to memorize, because we have so many things that we can't remember. So it's not a necessary part of our brain that we use. But some of the key parts of Islam is monotheism, that there is one God, it is Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. There's plenty of religions around the world who view Christians as polytheists, not monotheists. And if you try to look at it from an outsider's perspective, especially from the perspective of the Catholic Church, you have the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Well, are those all three of those everlasting? Do they all have godlike power? Sounds like three different gods to me. If you're not raised in it, it makes more sense. Also, you have things like angels. Again, immortal, have superhuman powers, do things that gods can do. Sounds like a god to me. Again, Christians, and that's part of being in that faith, don't look at it that way, but from the outside, there's plenty of religions that view Christians as polytheists as opposed to monotheists. And that was a big part of the early Islam, is to take more of the Jewish approach, which is there is the God of Abraham, and that's it. Now, there's two separate primary sects of Islam, Sunni and Shia Islam, and I can never keep the two of them straight, even when I'm doing this PowerPoint, so bear with me. But there is a distinct difference. I know the differences between the two, I just can never keep the labels straight in my head. Oops. And I was a bad teacher and didn't switch those slides. So if you're watching online, my apologies. Post the this file on the YouTube link for the video. Okay, so Islam did spread rather quickly in the 7th and 8th centuries in the Common Era. The spread of Islam took place not only through cultural and religious means, but also through direct military conquests, such as the assault of the Byzantine Christian Empire that culminated in the Battle of Yarmouk in 636. After that time, the southern regions of Anatolia, which is modern Turkey, and we kind of see the root of the capital of Turkey, which is Ankara, there, and virtually the whole of Levant near the modern Near East were under Islamic control. After the fall of Umayyad Caliphate that had been based in Damascus, the Abbasid Caliphate was established at Baghdad, where it endured for more than 500 years. Caliphate is another word for religious kingdom, where the center of power would have been. So if you look at like the Holy Roman, Roman Catholic Church, you could call Rome a caliphate for Europe, where the central part of it was located. But Islam did spread over the ancient world rather quickly, and really, in essence, kicked the Christians' butt all over Europe and the Near East. Now, part of what stopped the Moors in Spain were mountains. There's a mountain range between Spain and France. And the French forces, around the same time that Turkey and the Near East were being conquered, managed to keep the Muslims from being able to cross those mountains into most of continental Europe. Okay, and this is why I say I have a hard time keeping them straight, because I have this slide to go on to. Remember I said you're memorizing. Okay, Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, biggest difference between the two. Shia's Muslims on the right-hand side, they both believe in God's oneness. They both believe in a religion centered on the Quran. However, their focus is much more on the prophets of Muhammad and the descendants and of his leadership. He had something like 60 children. And they're working their lives toward the day of judgment, where they go to paradise or they go to hell, which is different, you know, because people of the Jewish faith don't believe in hell. So this is a separate, even though Judaism and Islam actually share a lot of commonalities, which is surprising why they fight so much. That is certainly one of the big ones, that there is a difference between Jews and Muslims. Sunni Muslims, on the other hand, more in the focus on the Quran and the modern leaders of Islam, rather than those who can trace their lineage back to Muhammad. Where you lived, you know, for example, Saudi Arabia is primarily Sunni Muslims. Iraq has several different types of Muslims there. Thank you to the British. One thing that you you do need to know about in the 272 is the British Empire took the tactic of putting people who hate each other into the same country because they'd be more focused on fighting each other than they are on fighting the British, which is why you have the Kurds, the Sunni Muslims in the Baghdad area, and the Shia Muslims in the south. They put them all in the same country, so all three of those groups would fight each other and not the British. Of course, look how well it worked. They're still fighting each other. Okay, moving on. I'm going to briefly talk about some of these caliphates and things that have to do with Islam. Why are they important to our study of 1001 Nights? This kind of give you a picture of the political sphere that this was written in. So you have some kind of idea what the writers knew about in their lives. The Abbasid, or which overthrew the Umayyad Caliphate, was the third dynasty of caliphates descended from Muhammad's uncle. Again, descendant, if you're a Shia Muslim, of the Prophet Muhammad. The caliphate's move to Baghdad from Damascus marks the Islamic Golden Age, during which Islam was shaped by Persian and Arab influences, and social conventions changed to permit the assimilation of non-Arab Muslims. For a very long time, very tolerant of other religions, particularly Christianity and Judaism. They considered them, and technically still do, people of the book. So if you were taken over by Muslim forces, you were allowed to continue practicing Christianity or Judaism. That's why it survives in Spain. But you couldn't be a voting member of society. You couldn't hold office unless you were a Muslim. But in terms of religious tolerance, the early Muslims really until the 1500s were pretty tolerant of other people's religions. Over martyrdom, international relations were established. Euclidean math was restored, algebra was developed, optics and mathematics were advanced, and architecture, textile, and paper industries flourished. We really owe a lot in terms of in the era of mathematics and astronomy and those sorts of things to the Muslims. While the Christians were in Europe picking their nose for 1,000 years and not advancing with their ideas in health and science and things like that, the Muslims were developing new technology, new ways of thinking in mathematics, so that when the Renaissance happened in Europe, they actually had something to work with Muslims had done. Now, this issue of scholarship over martyrdom, in other words, the meditation and focusing and trying to figure out how to be a good Muslim, what Allah's plan was, all those sorts of things, was emphasized much more than what you see in the early Christian church, where the focus is on martyrdom. Those who sacrifice their lives in order to convert Christians. St. Valentine is coming up, is a good picture of that type of thing. The story that's most often used, that there's no definite picture of St. Valentine, but the story is that he was a priest, early Christian priest in the Roman Empire, who continued to marry Christians legal by Roman law. So, he supported lovers, which is why he's the patron saint of love. But there's others, of course. St. Andrew, who was an apostle, was crucified in a horrible way. You see it, I can see it right now because somebody has the flag of Alabama on their hat in the classroom. That is a cross of St. Andrew, and that's the type of cross he was crucified on, with his legs and arms spread out in the necks so they could be dislocated before he suffocated. Crucifixion is not a very good way to go. Ways to be put down by the state. Okay. And this is a little bit later, and it's kind of a precursor to what we're going to be looking at with Beowulf. and Sir Gawain in the Green Knight. But just to let you know what's going on in the world, the Mongols in the 13th century began to spread out all over the Near and Far East. On one of our honors trips to Atlanta, they had a Mongolian display, and it was really interesting to see how these nomadic tribes could just keep moving and moving and moving. And in northern China, Genghis Khan, who began the Mongol Empire, fathered so many children that I think something like 3% of people who live in China are descendants of Genghis Khan. Now, when you think they have almost 2 billion people in China, that's a pretty amazing statistic. I mean, the thought is that he may have fathered as many as 30,000 children. Busy dude. Okay. I do want to focus on the stuff that's primarily our interests. The Ottoman Empire was an important part of the Near Eastern Muslim world because they fought a lot with the Christians, particularly in Austria and what's now the Balkan states. That's why parts of that area are still Muslim today. Bosnia-Herzegovina is a Muslim country, and during the war in the 90s, part of that was a religious war between the Eastern Orthodox Christian Serbs and the Muslim Bosnians. But what we're looking at with the Ottoman Empire is very similar to what we see in Rome and Greece, a slave-based economy with cultural elites, with a variety of different cultures and languages and religions, all under one flag in the Ottoman Empire. And as I mentioned earlier, religious tolerance didn't mean equality. They may have allowed you to keep your religion once you were conquered, but you couldn't hold a place of power if you indeed were not of the ruling religion. All right, we are going to skip this because we're not going to get to it in the book. Let's get to 1001 Nights. You're like, finally. Historical context is important with these works. I often tell people that if you're planning on being an English major, make sure you come close to being a history minor because the history is important to understanding literature. They're kind of intertwined. 1001 Nights was written by many unknown authors over centuries in countries in the Middle East. The first document bearing any evidence of 1001 Nights was a single piece of old Syrian paper that dates from, so actually, I was wrong when I give you your quiz answers. Well, since I was wrong, everybody gets it right no matter what you answer. So you all got at least 1 out of 15 on the quiz. Good job. It was discovered in 1948 by a scholar studying in a Cairo archive. The Nights circulated through the Mediterranean, finding its way into other collections, including Boccaccio's Decameron and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Now, the date there, 1948, is where they found this original piece. This is the oldest of this version of the stories that we have. The Arabian Nights or 1001 Nights existed much before the 1948 discovery. They just didn't have the oldest. Okay, I do have to apologize. This PowerPoint kind of bounces back and forth between the Christian and the Muslim world. But back to Christian Europe. The medieval map, with its deeply religious imaginative geography and central focus on Jerusalem, illuminates the ways in which the repeated cycles of European warfare around the Mediterranean and Middle East, called the Crusades, function both as a military campaign and control of the spiritual homeland. The Muslims took Jerusalem. Much of the Crusades, their goal, or at least their stated goal, was to take the Holy Land back from the Muslims. Now, Mappa Mundi, we can probably guess what this, we know what a map is, right? Anybody taking Spanish or French? Mundi? Can you see the base here? What does mundo mean in Spanish? The world, map of the world is what Mapamundi means. One notes a shift from the way the symbolic geography of the world map, or Mapamundi, toward the east, with the Garden of Eden at the top and centered on Jerusalem. So in other words, the picture of the world, and this is again why I'm going over this PowerPoint, dictates the worldview for people. So if you really believe the center of the universe is Jerusalem, that the Garden of Eden is kind of this magical place on top of the world, and that you're away from the center of the world, going to picture themselves as less significant than they might otherwise do. Our current modern maps, or the one that you probably saw in your geography classes in elementary school, we can tell the nationality of who made that original map. It was a German. If you look at a lot of modern world maps, Germany is in the center of it. And there's things like Greenland is much smaller than it is in actuality. Africa is much smaller than it is in actuality. Europe is much bigger than it is in actuality. So your maps can kind of change your worldview. This map was replaced by Ptolemaic maps based on the empirical observations and instructions of the 2nd century Greek astronomer Ptolemy on the medieval navigation charts. Because if you have a map that's based off religion and not geography, and you actually try to use that to sail with, you're going to have issues. Okay, so just to let you know about what's going on basically in the second half of our reading in this unit with things like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The First Crusade was in 1095 in the Common Era. And did for a little while establish the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. But also, what really was bred in the Crusades and lasted for a long time was a deep-seated anti-Semitism, or an antagonistic relationship with those of the Jewish faith. Because once the perception that somebody of the Jewish faith, their ancestors were responsible for the death of Christ, and they should be punished forever for that, that's an issue. And part of the Crusades, you have to have, if you're going to ask somebody to walk for 3 or 4 months, to go to a place they've never seen before, to kill people they've never met, you have to give them a higher reason for doing it, okay? And if the higher reason for doing it is to take back the Holy Land for Christians and let Christians control it for the first time in hundreds of years, well, then that can get some people to join those crusades. Okay, some of the things that are developing during this era, and it directly relates to 2 works that we're going to be starting actually next week. The Western view of the epic, a story of a person, a great person, the story of a people, or of a major event or battle. So, like, for example, the movie 300 is an epic because it celebrates the Battle of Thermopylae, when outnumbered Greeks, now there wasn't 300 of them, there was about 1,800, managed to hold off the Persians for a significant amount of time, even though they were outnumbered. Story of a people. Genesis and Exodus are often considered to be epic stories in the Bible because they're the base story for those of the Jewish faith. The story of a person, you know, the epic of the Odyssey, the story of Odysseus and his troubles with getting back home to Ithaca. Now, another development in the Middle Ages that we should be aware of is the Romance, particularly Arthurian romances, stories of Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, which Sir Gawain and the Green Knight would fall into that category, because Sir Gawain is one of Arthur's knights. These really developed as most of the Arthurian legends, which are distinctly English or British, were told in French, which is why you have Sir Lancelot du Lac as one of the primary characters. You know, you had to have the French knight be a big player if it's being written by the French. But anytime you see romances, it's a long story of, generally speaking, a tale of chivalry, of knights and kings and castles, usually Arthur or his knights, generally speaking, in quest for the Holy Grail, things of that nature. Why is it important to note it now? Because toward the end of this class, we are going to get to Don Quixote, which is a Spanish novel that makes fun evil romances. So we're going to look at one with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and we're also going to get to Don Quixote. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop at Petrarch because that's going to be a little bit later on. I may revisit this PowerPoint later, but let me go ahead and stop the sharing. Okay.